Hi, this is the Philosophical Angle, and I am your host, Chris Angle. The purpose of the Philosophical Angle is to discuss the concepts and ideas in current media. With me is my co-host and discussant, Rick Samuelson. Rick is a venture capitalist out on the West Coast, and Rick graduated from Yale and Wharton. Good to see you, Rick.
Good to see you.
This week, our discussion will be the presidential candidate, Donald Trump. And among those positions he has spoken about is free trade. And I think free trade is a concept that needs to be analyzed and discussed here as it will become in the forefront of the political debates that are going to be coming forth in the next year. So with that, I'm going to start a discussion of free trade. And let's start. So here we are. The concept of free trade. Is it a good thing for nations to be involved in free trade? And so what's it made up of? Well, obviously, it's got two words, free and trade. Trade, we're going to define that as equaling a sacrifice for a reward. And a reward is made up of the what you get for your sacrifice and why you expend in your sacrifice your information and knowledge, your time, your effort, and your material, if it's for a product, amidst an atmosphere of risk. And free, I'm going to define that as without government coercion or taxation or tariffs, which will allow goods to freely flow from one country to another. And so there are objections and there are benefits to free trade. Some of the objections are out there are produced by labor unions and the companies that employ the labor unions. Let's go over a couple of these complaints. Labor unions often state that free trade lowers the standard of living for Americans by allowing goods from lower wage foreign countries. And in the case of the presidential candidate, Donald Trump, he talks about China frequently as a producer of foreign goods that are inexpensive. And these come into the United States and displace our labor. And in some cases, the labor unions will cry out that these are hurting American jobs. It seems to be a natural complaint, and companies also, they complain about the same thing. And they complain about also, in addition, that the competition from foreign companies becomes intensified, and they complain that the other company is unfair, and they use words like dumping and sweatshops, and that this dumping and sweatshops are unethical. And so they complain to the government to help them so that they don't have to compete against such practices. And they do that because competition is inimical to one's nature, and no one likes it because it makes it more difficult in your life when another entity is competing with you in the same niche. So companies have to strive and they increase their sacrifice, if we up here, and they increase their sacrifice in order to get perhaps even a diminishing reward. And so they complain about free trade. Of course, on the other end, they don't complain about free trade when they export goods to countries that demand the type of goods that they produce. So let's go to the other side of the ledger, to the benefits of free trade. As we stated that companies didn't like the increase or intensified competition, but there are benefits to competition, and companies strive to make themselves different, and it lowers the cost of goods in doing so, and this raises the standard of living for Americans. And this happens because of what I'm going to call the law of differentiation. A company strives to make itself better by differentiating themselves into their particular economic niches. So, for example, Ford and General Motors differentiate themselves by producing designs of cars that are different, and so that they are not exactly the same, so that they can sell something that is slightly different from their competition. In other words, they're differentiating themselves from their competition. They'll often, because of the law of differentiation, put in research into their products and come out with new types of things that they put into their cars that make it better and differentiate themselves further from their competition. So let's go to page 2 of our little diagram. So free trade, it causes worldwide competition. And as we've stated, companies strive to get better and find a niche and evolve into that niche due to the law of differentiation. And this is accomplished by efficiencies. In other words, your sacrifice to get a reward is then supplanted because of the law of differentiation that injects more knowledge and information that the company develops into a more efficient product, and you get another sacrifice reward ratio, and the difference is the efficiency. And these efficiencies are added into the product, and we'll give you a simple example here. A tool is made by, let's say, by a company or by an individual. Let's say let's go to really a rudimentary example, a bow and arrow. Well, it was invented because with a bow and arrow, you could, the inventor could obtain more meat, which equals success. And he did that by inventing and using his knowledge and information to produce the tool. And from this meat that is added to his lifestyle, it's goodness, and also produces. It not only produces food, it produces the skin can be used for clothing and other goodnesses. Other things can be made from the increased amount of success that the tool provides. Cooking and other materials can be used for various purposes, and this brings his family up away from misery, and that provides the incentive to make the tool. And this continues because there's another dictum here which we want to add. In addition to the law of differentiation, there's another law that provides that we always continue to demand goodness in our lives. And thus we're going to call it the dictum of the never-ending demand for the good. And this provides the continuity of an ongoing demand for any trade at all, whether it's intra-company or intra-country or international, inter-country. So what happens when these low-priced goods, or it doesn't even have to be low-priced, It can be high technology that still competes with directly with our high-tech companies. They come into a country, and Schumpeter once talked about this and called it creative destruction. It's from the collateral damage of the competition, coming in, competing with your own labor forces at a better rate or a better efficiency, and the consumers come in and they choose the new company from, well, in the case of Donald Trump, he cites China. So these low-cost goods come in, and suddenly some guys and some people here are out of a job. As we stated, competition can be inimical to our situation. So it provides a difficulty and a hardship for those that are now displaced. And they have to reform and regroup and retrain, and they have to go out and get another goodness by getting another job. And they automatically want to go because they have demands too, and they need to live their lives, so they go out and try to reform and retrain. But nevertheless, it's a hardship. So there is this creative destruction. Is it a good thing, or is it not? So we're going to talk about that a little bit more here. It comes up. It brings forth a significant question. Does the creative destruction, is it a good process or a bad process? In other words, is it good for society or not so good for society? Well, let's go down here to this box here. It does create a difficulty and hardship, and it causes one to go out and retrain and regroup, which infers that there's going to be a gathering or significant change in the knowledge of the individuals. And they go out and try and find a higher standard of living because they're going to be retrained, or they seek other knowledge within another niche of society. And so when product A enters the U.S., it enters because of the law of the limitless demand for the good, and society here will want to enjoy the efficiencies of the new product coming in from China. So from that, I think that this will cause the creative destruction, does cause displacement of labor, but it produces ever greater products, which because of the ever greater production of knowledge, which is also a overall good for the society. And it keeps society, the amount of knowledge within the society, constantly going forward and growing because of the two laws that we've discussed, the law of differentiation and the law of constant demand, really are the results of the creative destruction that Schumpeter talks about. So overall, because this creative destruction allows society to gather and become even more, to gather and accumulate more knowledge, the concept of creative destruction and free trade is a very good thing for society. Enough enough for me. Let's go to Rick and see what he thinks about free trade and the policies of Don Trump as the presidential contender and leading in the polls presently. Rick, what do you think?
Well, as far as the value of free trade is concerned, I was under the impression that it was a matter of settled economic doctrine ever since Ricardo invented or wrote about the notion of comparative advantage. And more particularly, the Republican Party and conservatives generally have, at the margin, tended to favor free trade agreements, and promotion of trade wherever it makes sense. So to see a Republican candidate who at various times has said a lot of different stuff, much of it negative about the current free trade regime and its practice, is nothing if not a surprise. He has, for example, come out publicly against the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement, which was promoted by the Obama administration and which has won bipartisan support. In fact, it could not have passed without Republican support. So you have an instance here where arguably the leading Republican candidate stands athwart a kind of basic and long-standing principle favored by the Republican Party. And, that is not to say that there haven't been instances of cheating, and there's a whole mechanism for handling documented instances of dumping of goods and so on and so forth. And certain trade agreements have been more favorable and others less favorable, but it doesn't take a genius to see that over many, many years now, until quite recently actually, traded goods have grown at a level more rapidly than GDP in general. So trade has, by definition, added to the economic value of not only the United States, but the many other countries who engage in trade.
Throughout, I think we can make that statement throughout history. Would you not say that throughout history, those countries that have practiced free trade have been able to enjoy economic growth? Is that a fair statement that throughout history this has been true?
I can't think of any instance where a country has cut itself off from free trade and prospered as a result of it.
Right. Actually, there's a famous statement or aphorism regarding when goods don't cross borders, armies do. What do you think of the verity of that statement?
I think there's a lot of truth in that. I also think there's a lot of truth in the obvious observation that in countries that suffer that situation, military dictatorships tend to thrive. Let's consider the example of North Korea. Let's consider the example of Cuba. These countries are largely isolated and they are dirt poor. And that's partly because they have no access to, or very limited access to, free trade.
It brings up an interesting question. Cuba, now opened up by Obama. I thought a very good thing that he's done. What do you think about Cuba, the opening of Cuba? And on the one hand, you're dealing with a repressive regime. On the other hand, free trade is probably one of the very ways to open it up. What do you think?
I think that decision was, for other reasons, morally compromised and falls into a pattern of being extremely generous to long-standing enemies at the expense of long-standing allies. So uh, while one should welcome every effort to increase free trade globally, when you have renegade regimes like that, which torture the citizens and so on and so forth, I think it gives one pause in terms of what conditions could have been set for providing access to free trade. And it appears as if none have been set.
None have been set. Explain that for me.
In other words, we simply open the door for Cuba with no conditions, when we might have potentially, and by the way, the free trade arrangement, or whatever free trade Cuba is able to engage in with the United States, is almost entirely to the advantage of Cuba, right? We may get some cigars and a few other agricultural items, but Cuba's a third world country with a very weak economy. So the advantages that Cuba will realize in terms of access to U.S. goods far exceed what we will realize. That being the case, we were in a position when we negotiated the opening up of Cuba to insist on certain conditions regarding how they treat their political prisoners, how they treat their own people, and as far as I can see, none of those issues were ever raised.
So do you have an overall conclusion as to whether that was uh, a good happening, a good event, or not?
I think politically it was a disaster because a brutal dictator has once again been rewarded for being a brutal dictator. In terms of the uh, enhancement global world trade, it's clearly a good thing, but given the size of the Cuban economy, it's a very, very tiny increase.
Okay, but the longest journey begins with the first step, and so a small increase will be welcomed by the Cuban people, I'm sure, if free trade is allowed to develop between Cuba and the United States. We, of course, as you mentioned, get a few cigars, and for those cigars, we'll be able to send whatever it is that they need. I'm sure they need a lot. But of course, free trade means the swap of production of one society versus the swap of the production of another society. After all money is nothing else but a representation of that which you produce. So, although the free trade will be small, I think it's a great leap forward, and I was really glad to see it. I think it also really free trade is what broke down the East German Wall. What do you think about that?
Uh, I think I think that's a very complicated situation. Um, I think in the absence of Mikhail Gorbachev, uh, the collapse in the Soviet countries, the Soviet communist countries, uh, could have taken quite a bit longer. Um, what is clear is that centralized planning and a an extremely hampered trade regime, wherein those countries were only allowed to trade really with each other for the most part. Uh, at the end of the day, so misallocated capital and resources that a collapse in those economies was inevitable. or partial collapse. I mean, because some of them were much worse off than others. East Germany, because of its relationship with West Germany, was probably the wealthiest of them at the time. But I think in the absence of the political will that Mikhail Gorbachev exhibited, I'm not sure when the collapse of the wall would have happened. It could have taken much longer. I mean, on the one hand, I'm amazed that the North Korean regime has been able to last this long, and seems to show no signs of collapsing despite absolutely dirt poor poverty that prevails up there. And frankly, I've been up to the demilitarized zone and seen what the place looks like. And the first thing you notice is there are no trees, because all the trees have been cut down to as firewood for heat.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's get back to the presidential candidate, Trump. And would you have any advice to him regarding his policies? We all know about immigration, but extraneous to immigration, and particularly about free trade, any overall advice for his campaign?
Well, I think as long as he adopts policies that are clearly frustrate pro-growth, and one of those is his stance on free trade. Now, he's somewhat inconsistent. If you look at some of the statements I've gathered together, he has at times seemed slightly empathetic to growing free trade, but the tenor of his comments are generally quite negative, particularly as they're directed against China, Japan. He's often accused them of manipulating their currencies. If they're manipulating their currencies, it's because their central banks are printing money, and if he's going to level that accusation against any central bank, I think the place to start is pretty obvious, and it's not China. So that sort of accusation, I think, muddies the whole argument. The reality is the United States economy, and more particularly large U.S. corporations, have benefited enormously from ever-growing free trade. The problems Caterpillar, for example, is experiencing, the problems they're experiencing right now in terms of profits, is almost entirely because their exports are drying up on account of the emerging markets faring so poorly. Boeing depends heavily on exporting planes. So if there isn't foreign appetite and a free trade regime that's actively supported by the United States, these companies in particular, and the U.S. economy as a whole, will suffer over time. And in fact, at the moment, U.S. exports are down almost 6% in the first half. If anything, the candidates should be going out of their way to make this an issue and ensure that particularly U.S. exports are in as favorable a position as possible to grow and recover from where they were a year or two ago.
Okay, excellent point for the other candidates. Well, I want to thank you for joining us, Rick. Our time is up for this week's episode of The Philosophical Angle. We'll see you next week. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.